Hi, I'm Jeff Alex, host of Living Well with MS, the podcast from Overcoming MS.
Hi, I'm Jack McNulty, a professional chef and serious OMS foodie. Welcome to Ask Jack, a special Living Well with MS podcast series, where I'll be answering food and cooking related questions submitted by you, our Overcoming MS community.
If you'd like to submit a question for a future episode of Ask Jack, please email us at podcast@overcomingms.org. That's podcast@overcomingms.org. And now, let's rev up our appetites and dig into this episode. Welcome to the season finale of Ask Jack, featuring the prodigious culinary talents of professional chef Jack McNulty. Sorry, actually, I know Jack just asked me to say, could you say professional cook? So I'll change that. Professional cook Jack McNulty, answering food-related questions generated by you, our community. Check out the show notes below that dig into the topics covered in this episode in more detail. Ask Jack will return in 2022 for its second season, where we will feast on even more of our community's questions about all things cooking and eating in an OMS-friendly way. You can submit your questions for Ask Jack anytime by emailing them to podcast@overcomingms.org. So, in this episode, we've created a set of commonly asked questions around the holiday season. With the onslaught of the holidays upon us, people following the OMS programme face major challenges in making traditional holiday recipes compliant with their dietary choices under the OMS programme. Jack has had ample experience in navigating this narrow channel of healthy eating and holiday food fun, and what he's learned and hopes to convey to you is that following OMS dietary guidelines doesn't mean you have to forgo the joy of yummy holiday eating. So let's dig in. And welcome, Jack.
Thanks, Jeff. Great to be back for another little conversation about food, and this time specifically holiday food. Looking forward to it.
And I think it's definitely a time when food is central, isn't it? There's many different festivities going on at this time of year, but they all do seem to centre around food more than maybe at other times of year.
That's right. Yeah, there are lots of customs. There are lots of parties. Businesses have office parties, things like this. So yeah, there's lots of opportunity to have food in front of you. But of course, with that, there's also lots of opportunity to have peer pressure to slip away from the diet a little bit. And I guess that's probably one point where we could spend a little bit of time talking about.
So to start off with, how do you keep from cheating when you've got everyone eating all this huge array of... and it does tend to be more non-compliant food as well. That's the other thing, I think, because people see it... They have this sort of maybe unhealthy food as kept on a pedestal. Like, okay, I shouldn't be eating this all the time, but it's the holidays, so I'm going to have this high-fat, really lots of maybe more prepared, processed, lots of things and people think of that because, they shouldn't do it all the time, but it's the holidays, so we'll do it now. So how can you keep away from cheating, if you like, when everyone else is eating all that food?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, isn't it? It's perplexing to me how people celebrate the holidays by allowing excuses to creep in, and that's really what that is. Willpower. It's all about the willpower and just being courageous and being strong and sticking to what you believe in. So for me, when I was just starting out, I just kept trying to remind myself of what was my goal. What was the whole goal that I was trying to achieve by following the OMS lifestyle and the diet in particular. And then I wanted to understand what are the goals of OMS? What are the ultimate goals of OMS? Of course, that's keeping inflammation down and improving your blood profile. And so I really wanted to always remind myself, are my actions, are my thoughts, the food that I'm taking in, is that in alignment with those goals, my goals and also the goals of within OMS? And I think that's just really helpful to always just keep that in perspective as you move along and through the holidays. Certainly helps when you run across situations where peer pressure comes into play. Maybe it's family members or friends that are saying, oh, come on, it's the holidays, a little cheese is not going to hurt you and that sort of thing. But that's the time when it's really most important to really stick to what you're believing in and moving forward with pursuing those particular goals. I also did something that was, I'm not so sure I really want to share this publicly, but now that I've started, I guess I have to. What I did is I kind of gave those little situations that came up, those little stressors, those little pressures that would come up. I gave them names, and I just spoke to them. So, for instance, this is a bit corny, but I gave cheese the name Charlie. For no particular reason other than it both begin with C. And so every time I had an urge at the beginning I would really like to have a piece of cheese right now, then I just talk to Charlie and I would just say, thanks for coming by, Charlie, but we've had this discussion before and I appreciate what you've done for me in the past, but you're not welcome here anymore, so feel free to leave. And for me, that helped a lot, just to kind of play a little bit of a game like that, to give that a particular name and just deal with it that way and acknowledge it and then just move on. There was also on the OMS website, there was a blog posting a year or two ago from an OMS ambassador. I believe her name was Carolyn Kaufman, who wrote a nice piece about this particular topic, about not allowing or not slipping, a little bit during the holiday season. That might be worthwhile to go check out.
And the other thing is, so we'll come on to roasts, which is a big thing, but also sweets and puddings, cakes. Do you have any ideas for sweet food that you could make for the holidays, that you could take to a party, that you can enjoy with your family?
Tons. We could probably do a whole hour on this just alone. I think that, especially now, there are just so many different ideas available through books, through various community groups, various organizations. It's just so simple to figure out a way to turn something plant-based or to make it a little bit more OMS friendly, depending on whether you're using egg whites or not, certainly. So there are lots and lots of ideas out there. For me, I just like to, I really enjoy this time of year because I like sweets. It's no secret I have a little bit of a sweet tooth. But I love exploring and just keep reinventing. For instance, I took a classic holiday drink, eggnog. Are you familiar with eggnog?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it's so easy to make that plant-based. And so, a vegnog, if you will, and just cashew-based and create something like that. And then sharing it with other people just really adds a lot of enjoyment to the process. But certainly to get to the crux of your question, there's plenty and plenty of cakes, cookies, steamed puddings, sweet style breads, things like a babka or something like this. And I think that what you can do very simply is you can go out, search out, for instance, if you're trying to make a cake, just find something that's very ordinary, an olive oil based cake, for instance, that just pops into my head. And then look at that and look to include some Christmas spices to it, for instance, or dried fruits, or a combination of those two things. Perhaps even adding a little bit of alcohol, if you want, if that's something that's favorable to you, just to increase the sort of festiveness of it around the holiday period. It's very simple to do, to change the flavor profile of something that's just normal and making it a little bit more holiday-like.
Because a steamed fruit pudding is probably quite compliant. I don't think you need to do much to that, do you?
That's correct. Yeah, exactly. That's pretty simple.
And that's kind of the basis. In the UK, certainly, we have a Christmas pudding, which is kind of steamed, and a Christmas cake. And I don't know about other religions, but I mean, that's sort of a fruit cake. I mean, certainly other cultures, because my aunt's from Barbados, and her mother, who's deceased sadly, but she used to cook these incredible cakes. So she would every month she would fill a tub with dried fruit, and then she would top it up with rum. Mm-hmm. And then in each month she would take one of these tubs down, and then she would make this amazingly moist fruit cake. And then she would she would fill that tub, clean it, fill the tub with fruit, and put it on the end. She had 6 tubs, so it's every 6. So it took 6 months to make it across, and then each month it was topped up with more rum. So by the end of the 6 months, there was no recognisable fruit. It was just mush, but it was all heavily saturated in rum. The moistness of it was incredible. I think a lot of the alcohol had probably evaporated off, but I think it was probably. I wouldn't like to drive after eating much of this, and so it's a very different culture. This wasn't done, particularly as a religious thing at all. But just you can certainly have a fruit cake and a bit of alcohol if people have alcohol. Again, sort of adding that sort of Christmas flavors and everything.
Yeah, there are 2 recipes in the OMS cookbook that are very similar to these kinds of things. There's one it's simply called a Christmas cake. I think it has 3 ingredients. It's along the lines of what you were just describing, maybe not quite as involved in taking so long, because I think it's a little bit more instant. But it certainly fits the bill. And then there's another one called an Irish whiskey cake. From Jessica in Ireland, and it was quite fun making that with Ingrid when we were doing the cookbook together. When Ingrid was writing it, and we were testing some of those recipes, we had good fun with those particular recipes. Actually, making them, they're quite good, and I encourage people to check them out.
And you were saying about eggnog as well. Another one. There's probably a generic way of saying this, but there's a drink called Bailey's, which is very popular at Christmas in the UK. So it's coffee, whiskey based, and cream, and that's something I do every year. I kind of have a vague idea of the recipe, but actually, you were saying the experimentation is as much fun as anything, because I know that there'll be whiskey in there. There will be I put oat milk, oat milk whiskey, a little bit of espresso coffee, and something like maple syrup or some sort of sugary, syrupy flavour in there, and a little bit of vanilla. And I just sort of and actually, it's no problem testing it and then changing it a little bit and testing it some more and then changing it a little bit. Right. Testing is half the fun.
That's right, exactly. Put a little grated nutmeg on there and call it something else, and nobody's ever going to know.
No, it's good. Coming on to sort of the main course, if you like, there's 2 questions here that come. So, I'll start with the second one, which is actually this was asked. This is my first year with MS, and I'm new to OMS. I'm struggling to come up with ideas for food that I can enjoy during the holidays. And then, just to combine that with, do you have any ideas for an OMS-friendly roast? So, what sort of main event meals do you think you can cook in an OMS-friendly way? Because it is, again, we're sort of saying unhealthy, but it's also centred around meat as well. But that could be a ham, it could be turkey, but it's a beef as well. It's often centred around meat.
Yeah, it is. It's the central item around the table. Before I get to that, let me just address the issue with the first part of that question with someone just starting out first year with MS, struggling with different ideas of what to make during the holiday season. Maybe the OMS program is brand new to them, struggling trying to figure out what kinds of foods to eat. Certainly, for most people that have been following OMS for a while, I think this is very relatable. I think most of us dealt with this at some point or another, probably during the first year, in fact. And that's lifestyle changes are stressful, and it does take a lot of courage to go through them. You know, by definition, if you're making a lifestyle change, you're really not only changing your habits, but you're creating a little bit of a distance between what your friends and family might be doing as well. And so that's going to add some pressure and some different challenges along the way. So what I did during the first holiday is I sat down and I just tried to understand what was it about the holiday foods that I experienced and loved so much. What was it? Why did I like those? What were about those particular recipes that I enjoyed? And so I collected them. I got in touch with some family members and started collecting a little bit of those particular recipes that meant a lot to me. And I looked at them and asked myself, what can I do to make these recipes OMS compliant? And I was really surprised at how simple that was for the majority of recipes. And so for me, it was just a matter of making some slight adjustments, and basically it was the same sorts of foods. Now, obviously, you're not going to replace the roast at the center of the table. I grew up primarily with, I think we had mostly turkey and ham kind of thing. So that was the big thing around my table. But if you are in a family situation, I think that it's simple if your other family members are eating meat or eating things that you're not necessarily eating, to just have a discussion, a family discussion, saying, does it really need to be the central part of the table? Can we make that a little bit more off to the side, and then change the center of the table? Make it some dramatic sort of vegetable preparation. I think if you search around, it's pretty easy to find a roasted cauliflower recipe draped in pine nut sauce, for instance. That's very dramatic looking, and it's very tasty, and it's very much OMS compliant. Or some kind of other gratin or something of this nature. Or if you're eating fish, if that's something you decide to do, roasting a whole fish can be really dramatic, and replacing that with the traditional ham or turkey or things of that nature. I know that in the Southern Hemisphere, it's a much different situation. The weather's warm. People are actually barbecuing. They're out grilling, having different kinds of situations. I know years ago when I was visiting Australia during the holiday season, I actually had a Christmas Day dinner with Linda Bloom, the founder of OMS, and it was wonderful having grilled prawns and whole fish presented and that sort of thing. It was absolutely no problem for anybody involved to have such a dramatic type of OMS experience. And it's something that sticks with me today, even though I no longer eat fish.
Yeah, I found Australia's, they go one way or the other. Some people go very, because they still, because it was a British colony, they still stick with we have to have the big roast dinner, which is really unsuitable, because if you're anywhere in a sort of hot part of Australia, which is most of it, it's not really the most suitable food to have at that time of year. And also a lot of the shopping centres have got fake snow everywhere, which is very, very strange when you're in very high temperatures.
Yeah, I was a little shocked to see Santa Claus dressed with, in a surfing outfit.
Yeah. And the other thing, some things that I've come across, a vegan Wellington. So Wellington probably doesn't translate globally, but basically it's a beef dish traditionally. So it's a dish where you have beef covered in pastry with mushrooms and pate as well. So it's non-compliant, but basically it's the idea of it being wrapped in pastry. But there's a number of different recipes. There's a couple of people in Ireland called the Happy Pear who have a lot of videos available on YouTube, and they've got lots of cookbooks as well. Some of their stuff's non-compliant. Most of it is fairly compliant. They do tend to fry, which we can obviously dry fry or fry in water for onions. But actually, you get these delicious vegetable-based fillings inside, and they quite often use a phyllo pastry, which you can buy. Phyllo pastry is one of those things that I'm sure it's possible to make it, but making wafer-thin pastry is certainly beyond my talents. But actually, if you look around, it's not too hard to find compliant phyllo pastry. And actually, you can make a really delicious... And that's almost a centerpiece. Certainly, it's too big for one person to eat. And when I have that at Christmas, people will always have some of that. and they do. There's lots of different variations available, so you can do a sort of centerpiece which is compliant as well, and that certainly that would go in the center, but also there will be a ham or a turkey as well.
Sure.
And that's fine. And I think the other thing for me is it's about all the extras. So what makes it a celebration meal is all the extra bits, because what we call in the UK meat and two veg was the sort of traditional meal. It's a bit beyond that. So it's the things like we have a thing called Devil's on Horseback, which is prunes wrapped in bacon and baked in the oven. Well, I thought, okay, this could be redone, because I'd seen something about fake bacon where they'd use it's someone called Deliciously Ella, who's a UK based, and a lot of her stuff uses quite heavily coconut based, but it's worth having a look through for some of the things. She creates bacon using rice paper,
exactly,
and then makes a marinade which uses liquid smoke, soy sauce, garlic. There's some other things in there, but that's the sort of base of it, and soaks the rice paper in this, and then she uses that to make bacon. I thought, well, okay, if she used that to make a sort of bacon-like thing, then I could wrap prunes in that, and then I could bake them, and that would kind of be like Devil's on Horseback. And it is. It's exactly like it. I mean, it really gives you that smoky flavour combined with the fruity flavour, and it's got all the sort of flavour notes that you'd expect. And so the extra trimmings, I think that's, and you can, a lot of those things, and stuffing is another one we have a lot of stuffing is actually, you get a meat stuffing, which is sort of sausage meat, but you also get a vegetable one, which is sort of breadcrumb based, like often sage and onion, and you can make that, because actually that's fine. And so there's lots of things you think, okay, what are all the extra bits that you'd have, and can we do those? Can we do a red cabbage is another one that's commonly done. Yeah, absolutely. There's nothing wrong with red cabbage at all. That can be done with fruit, and
or even something as simple as just a potato puree, mashed potatoes, if you will. It's so simple to make that in an OMS compliant manner and make it extremely tasty. It's really not that difficult to do. Absolutely. This is just the hopefully it gives people the idea that, man, the world is just completely opened up in terms of what you can and can't, what you can have instead of what you can't have. There's so many more different options available, at least today, as opposed to maybe even 10 years ago. Just different techniques to know about, people sharing information on the internet, and different books and different places to go look. It's really, really quite easy. And back to your idea with the Wellington, it occurred to me that with phyllo dough, there's a recipe on the OMS website for strudel. And there's a strudel recipe on there. I know that because we did a video on that years ago, and I believe it's still on the website. But the strudel dough is almost identical to phyllo dough. The only difference being that it has vinegar in the ingredients, whereas phyllo dough wouldn't have that. It just allows it to stretch out very, very easily and very thin. But you could take something like strudel dough if you can't find phyllo dough in your area, or make it yourself. It's very simple to make. And just wrap your favorite vegetable-based loaf around a phyllo or a strudel dough, and basically you're making a savory strudel at that point, which is also something that's very interesting.
So we've sort of covered the main course, we've covered a bit of dessert, but then you get on to another thing which comes up a lot, and that's chocolates. So there's a couple of things here. So we've got what's allowed on the OMS diet, because is chocolate, I'll go on a bit more before you answer the question, but is chocolate an absolute no-no, like we just shouldn't have any, or is it something about chocolate that we shouldn't have? And what alternatives there are, and also there's a lot of terms that come up with cocoa, so we'll get on to cocoa, Dutch processed cocoa, cacao, all these different terms that we see, and what we can and can't use, and what we should and shouldn't do around chocolate.
Yeah, It's a complicated issue. Let's just start with that. And it's very tribal in its nature when you go out and look in the internet and things like this. It's almost a little bit like it reminds me a little bit like the split in opinions about things like coconut oil or coconut fat. There's certainly a lot of people out there that still believe that that's a very, very much of a healthy kind of ingredient to use in your cooking. But on the other hand, there's a increasing number of people that realize, no, the science says that, it's pretty heavy in saturated fat. Well, the same thing can be said for chocolate. And to understand that, maybe it's helpful to just kind of go through a little bit as to how chocolate is made. And then we can talk a little bit about the different terms along the way. It just gives people maybe a little bit of a better understanding that it's not necessarily what's being presented in the internet and out in the world in terms of all of those wonderful health benefits. Now, having said that, there are bits that are healthy, but let's talk about that as we go through. So first of all, it's really important to understand that chocolate in itself is not a whole food. So a lot of people like to say, oh, they're following this whole food plant-based diet, and then they're using things like chocolate and cocoa. It's not necessarily a whole food. It's heavily processed, actually. So chocolate begins with the cocoa plant and or cacao, however you want to pronounce it. And so it creates this sort of large fruit with a big pod that's filled with seeds. And in those seeds are actually where we're getting our chocolate from. So those seeds have a lot of pulp around them. And basically when they're harvested, they're split open and they take out all of that pulp and all of the seeds, and those are left to ferment. So those are usually fermented naturally, and the fermentation process can be anywhere from a few days to a short period of fermentation. But this is where the whole flavor of chocolate starts to develop, is in the fermentation process. And eating unfermented chocolate is a proposition I wouldn't wish on anybody. It's really horrible to taste unfermented cacao. It's just not edible at all. Even fermented, after being fermented and dried, it's extremely astringent, rather bitter, very acidic, and really not a pleasant experience, even in that state. And so this is what's done when chocolate is harvested. So the farmer is responsible for the fermentation, for the drying process, and then they're all bagged up, and then that's sold on the open market. And so chocolate producers will buy those beans that have been fermented and dried. Those beans are called chocolate nibs. You maybe have heard that term before, a chocolate nib or a cacao nib or cocoa nib, however you want to pronounce it. So those are susceptible, depending on the packaging, of quite a lot of microbial growth. So they have to be sort of purified once they're purchased, and just to ensure there's not a lot of harmful molds or bacteria that are growing on there. Generally, if you to eat those at that stage, it's again really, really unpleasant. So manufacturers roast those cocoa nibs, either whole or crushed, one way or another. And once they're roasted, they take on a different flavor. So now they're not sweetened, but they're mellowed considerably. And they have a nutty characteristic, and all these other aromas are opened up. Once that occurs, then they're crushed. That's turned into sort of a liquidy kind of, let's put it this way, it's cocoa solid suspended in fat, which is basically what you're left with. So it's about 50% fat and about 50% cocoa solids. At this point, that is pressed or put through what's like a sieve, basically, and pressed. And so the fat is drained out and you're left with cocoa solids. That fat is the cocoa butter. It basically has no flavor or very little flavor. It's about 50% of the mass that was in that process, and about half of that fat is saturated. And that's important to understand because that's not necessarily good for people following an OMS lifestyle. Now, the cocoa mass that has been pressed, that's dried and then ground very fine. That's what cocoa powder is, or cacao powder at that point. So depending on how much the manufacturer pressed the mass determines how much fat is left in the cocoa powder. And that can be anywhere from 1% to up to 20%, depending on the whim of the manufacturer. And that's why it's important to read labels to see how much fat is actually left into the cocoa powder. Of course, from that point, the manufacturers can turn everything into chocolate by taking the cocoa powder, the cocoa butter, and mixing in amounts of sugar or dried milk if they're making milk chocolate, that sort of thing. And then that's all combined and put through another process to create chocolate, or the chocolate bar that maybe we're familiar with. So in talking about the cocoa, there's some things to be aware of. Along the way, manufacturers can tone down the astringency, the bitterness and the acidity of the cocoa or the flavor by adding an alkaline to it. And that alkaline process neutralizes the acidity, but at the same time, it destroys almost all of the flavonoids, which is the healthy aspect of cocoa. And so that process is called Dutch process. It was invented in Holland. That's why it's called Dutch processed. So that process of adding an alkaline to the cocoa can occur just before the roasting. It can occur during the actual separation of the cocoa butter into the cocoa mass, or it can occur actually even later to make a chocolate bar taste less acidic and a little bit sweeter. So it can occur anywhere along the process. That's why it's difficult to determine the actual healthy aspects of cocoa or chocolate. And it depends on how much or if the alkaline process occurred. Now with cocoa powder, it's simple to determine that on your own. Most American-made cocoa powder is not subject to alkaline process. Most European cocoa is, and it's called European on the label. Sometimes it's called Dutch process. Sometimes it's called Dutched. And if there's nothing on the label, which is also possible, just your visual look will tell you whether it's been subject to this process. So one that's Dutch process will always be much, much darker in color, a really rich color of chocolate brown, if you will. Whereas if it hasn't been subject to this alkaline process, it's much lighter in color. Now, from a culinary perspective, does it make any difference? It does, actually, in baking, because the fact that the acids have been neutralized will determine the leavener that you can use. And we'll talk about that if you want to go down the path of baking powder and baking soda, or maybe we can leave that for another episode. But it is an interesting scenario. But the thing that is really important for people following the OMS diet to know is that first, cocoa powder or cacao is allowed in the OMS protocol. But there's some work to be done on the user end. You have to look at the labels. You have to understand how much fat is still left there, because there's a great variety with different manufacturers. Then if you're looking to increase the amount of cacao or cocoa, whether you're consuming nibs or powder, you have to understand, has it been subject to the alkaline method, which will destroy all of the health properties that you're looking to get, the flavonoid bits.
So
I think
if we take it into this sort of, if like there's three categories, there's what's bad for you, there's what's good for you, and there's a middle ground of neither. So to get rid of the what's bad for you things, we're basically looking at, like, a chocolate bar would normally have milk in it in the UK. So that's a big no-no. So definitely a chocolate bar. You do see vegan ones, but generally, if it's got milk in it, that's a no-no. Let's say it's a vegan one, doesn't have any milk. Then we're looking at saturated fat content. So if it doesn't have any milk and it's got a low saturated fat content, then we're not so much worried about the term. Cacao, cocoa, there's no legal basis there.
No.
They can just put whatever they want.
They're interchangeable.
Yeah.
They're just marketing terms, and they don't. Some people that claim to have healthy cocoa or cacao are saying that cacao is like raw. It hasn't been roasted. It has all of these high flavonoids and et cetera, et cetera. It may or may not be true. There's no way to really know that. Yeah. And it could be just put on there as a marketing claim.
And I'm assuming both cacao and cocoa are probably translations from Quechua in Peru or somewhere, like, and they probably were the same basis anyway. So we're using our own knowledge. So we're saying, okay, there's no dairy in there. It's low saturated fat. We've got some powder there that isn't bad for us. Now, the good for us, so we're avoiding Dutch or European processing. It makes it more likely. And then the other tip is to say, is it a dark brown or is it a mid-lighter brown? Mid-lighter brown is good, not Dutch process, not European process. But if in doubt, if it's low saturated fat, if it's dairy-free, it's not bad for us at least.
Right.
Okay,
right.
So that gives us...
It's a pretty good summation there. One other thing to just mention, just on the pure chocolate, if there's all of these percentages, 70%, 85%, 90%, that sort of thing. Here's what that means. The 70% means there's 70% cocoa product and 30% sugar.
Okay.
So the balance of whatever it is, if it's 85%, that means there's 15% sugar. So in a 100-gram bar of chocolate, 70% means there's 30 grams of sugar. That's like 3 tablespoons of sugar in that bar of chocolate. What it also is telling you on 70% chocolate, in a chocolate bar, is that there's roughly 35 grams of fat in that 70% 100-gram bar of chocolate, right? That's a pretty significant amount. And when you think about it, 35 grams of fat, and half of that fat is going to be saturated. So if you were to sit down and eat what some people otherwise consider a relatively healthy 70% chocolate bar, you're going to get about 17 grams of saturated fat by that indulgence. That's why it's not recommended within the OMS protocol.
Okay, but we can certainly make chocolate-based food by using cacao. Certainly, it might be healthy, and certainly not unhealthy. It's relatively straightforward to do that.
That's right. And then I think that's probably a good place to leave that conversation. But I think it's really important to put that information out there and then just let people make their own decision. Is it something I'm going to really want to have? Yeah, sure. I think having chocolate, in my diet, I have it occasionally with cacao, not so often, but occasionally. And yeah, it tastes good. It brightens the mood. There's no question about that. Whether there's a lot of, extreme health benefits, I think that's certainly up for debate.
Yeah, a bit goes into my Bailey's mix-up, actually. That's another thing that goes in there, a little bit of cacao. Okay, is there any other tips that we should add for this holiday season?
I think first, just smile a lot. That's what I always like to tell people. I think it's always, I mentioned this earlier, but I think it bears repeating that it's really, really important to just constantly remind yourself, especially if you're at the beginning of the journey, of what your goals are and what are the goals of OMS, and following a dietary lifestyle change that's going to benefit you in the future. The goal of reducing inflammation, of improving your blood profile, those are really, really strong and powerful goals to have. And if you can achieve that through diet, it's going to make a big change to your life for the better. Those are positive changes that everybody can make. And I think if you can focus on that in the holiday, that's the best gift that you can give yourself.
And one final point from me, it's often a time when we're eating out as well. It could be with friends, it could be with work. I have found that a good restaurant has no problem following our dietary recommendations. And I basically point them to the website and give them a little list myself, but also saying, here's the website and you can find all the recommendations are there. Every good restaurant I've been to have no problem. I think the chefs actually enjoy it. They think, okay, here's something a bit different, and then they'll come back to me and saying, how about this? And often with 3 courses, they'll say, here's starter, main course, dessert. What do you think about that? And yeah, generally very good. Often a choice. They'll actually, or sometimes even on the night, they'll give me my own menu and say, oh, you can choose from these things, and they have no problem at all. And actually, anywhere that they've said, no, this is a set menu, is probably not a great restaurant. I think, they are probably, if they can't adapt, then are they just reheating something? If it's the point where they can't adapt it just a bit, then is it really being freshly cooked anyway? And is that a great restaurant? But I do find, just get in touch, give the restaurant, give them notice, give them some time to think about it. And I have found that the vast majority of restaurants have no problem. I'm always I try and be apologetic and try and, be understanding for them. They're busy, it's a really hard job, and they've not had a problem. I think that, they don't have a problem. And often the chef will come out to me and say, what did you think of that? How was that? And yeah, I think you can eat well in restaurants. You have to have a level of trust that they are doing what they say, but yeah, I think if you communicate with them, give them notice, then you can find some delicious food cooked for you.
I think you're right. I think, from my experience in working, and most of my restaurant experience has occurred in really high-end restaurants, and I found that any time anybody came in and with some sort of allergy or some sort of request for something new, it was fun. It did break up the service. It generally created a little bit more stress in the kitchen, but sometimes, as cooks, we sort of feed off stress situations in the kitchen, and that just made it a little bit more of a challenge. And it was, the other common feature about chefs is we like to have our ego fed. And if you do make something, you do want to go out and get that feedback. You want to ask, how was that? And it's a proud moment when you create something that's going to make someone else really happy and satisfied. So most good restaurants, I think you're absolutely right, are going to be able to adjust.
Okay, and with that, I just wish everyone a happy holiday season.
I do as well, and a very good and fantastic start to the new year. First time I said it this year.
And I hope you join us again for Ask Jack next year.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to this episode of Ask Jack, the special 5-part series where we dive into questions from our OMS community about all things food. Please check out this episode's show notes at overcomingms.org/podcast. You'll find all sorts of useful links and bonus information there. If you would like to submit a question for a future episode of Ask Jack, please email us at podcast@overcomingms.org. You can also subscribe to the show on your favourite podcast platform so you never miss an episode. Ask Jack is kindly supported by a grant from the Happy Charitable Trust. If you would like to support the Overcoming MS charity and help keep our podcast advertising free, you can donate online at overcomingms.org/donate. Thank you for your support. Ask Jack is produced by Overcoming MS, the world's leading multiple sclerosis healthy lifestyle charity. We are here to help inform, support and empower everyone affected by MS. To find out more and subscribe to our e-newsletter, please visit our website at overcomingms.org. Thanks again for tuning in and see you next time.